I'm sitting here with John O'Sullivan, the distinguished former editor of National Review magazine, member of Mrs. Margaret Thatcher's cabinet, bon vivant, man about town, and dear friend, to talk about his contribution to our new book, Against the Corporate Media, 42 Ways the Press Hates You. John, you wrote at my request on the revolving door between politics and journalism, how once there was a fairly ironclad gateway between the two professions and you couldn't move back and forth. Now it seems to be not only acceptable, but practically de rigueur. Can you speak to that for a bit?
Well, your tradition in the United States of that previously existed, you couldn't cross between government and press and back again. That's not quite so ironclad as in Britain, and at the same time, there hasn't been the same level of crossover that has since happened in the last 20 or 30 years. I mean, America breached that rule. I mean, in my essay, I cite a famous lecture given by David Broder of the Washington Post, who was, people say, a much respected political correspondent, and he genuinely was respected. He
was the dean of Washington correspondence.
He was respected across the spectrum.
Yeah.
But he gave a lecture warning people in, I think it was about 88, something like that, about the dangers of this development of somebody, as he put it, a senior member of the press slipping into a phone box and coming out as a minister or as more likely a very senior high-level bureaucrat in something like the State Department or the Environmental Ministry and so on. And then after a period, particularly if his party lost the election, returning to the media with the added kind of status and respect of someone who'd been at the very top of politics making these major decisions. And there were lots of quite reasonable arguments given in defense of this going back and forth when Broder strongly denounced it. And he warned that once the press and the government becomes too close together, once they start being close friends rather than having an essentially antagonistic relationship, a relationship of inquiry and questioning and criticism, then the liberties of the people would gradually evaporate, because the government and the media, once they become two different heads on the same body, then you don't want a world really in which the people who control the newspapers also run all the industries, right, and so on.
Well, especially in the United States, where the founding fathers meant the press to be a check on the government, not part of the government. And yet now we have quite explicitly, if a Democratic administration is out of power, it parks its people at the New York Times, or they become a CNN contributor or even a Fox News contributor. So they're sort of on ice for a while until the winds shift, and then they're back in Washington again. So now it's a shuttle, not even a revolving door anymore.
Well, that's right. And of course, that's true even when the people in question, namely someone who's had, when they have what I'd call a checkered record in government, or if they've even been suspected of jiggery-pokery, some kind of breach of the rules, they now suffer no penalty at all. They go into senior positions, as you say, advisors of CNN. And of course, some of the major media organizations, I thought, put it well, are in effect the Democratic Party in exile if there's a Republican administration.
Yeah.
I think the same criticisms apply to the right as well, but less seriously, because the fact is, there are fewer conservatives at the top of American journalism.
And, that's correct.
And in the old days, you went into journalism because it was a kind of job, well, for the working class or the lower middle class who hadn't been able to go to university, and didn't have any of the easy routes to success. They went into journalism, and journalism, I think, then there's always, in my view, been a liberal bias in journalism. One of your other contributors yesterday said this very well. He said that there's a bias in journalism to liberalism that emerges from the fact that if ever you have a policy by government changing a tax rate or increasing a particular benefit, well, they'll go out and ask the questions traditionally, how is this fair to the people at the bottom of the scale?
Yes.
Is somebody at the top getting some kind of undeserved benefit from this change? These kind of questions. Well, you might say, and John McGurk did say that there is this liberal bias, and I think I concede that.
Yeah.
And it's one you'll never get rid of. But now the liberal bias is almost all-encompassing, and it's accompanied by a genuine hostility to the policies, attitudes, and the personalities of the right. I mean, people, let's leave Trump aside. Ronald Reagan, until he actually left office after 2 very successful terms, Ronald Reagan was produced as every kind of right-wing monster.
Yeah.
And we forget that now because his success means that those charges and accusations don't seem sensible. But at the time, he was not portrayed as a successful or compassionate policymaker. David Broder again said something interesting here. He said that the press had to treat Reagan better than it had done in the campaign after he'd been shot and when he'd behaved gallantly and reassured the country in various ways. He said it's going to be impossible for the Democrats to paint him as a cold-hearted, callous or man anymore.
Yes.
And that happened. But that was because of Reagan's behavior forced the press to treat him more sympathetically, rather than because it was their that wasn't their original act. They didn't do that originally.
No. So there was a famous editorial halfway through the first Reagan term. The stench of failure hangs over the Reagan administration. I forget whether that was the Washington Post or the Boston Globe, but one of them.
Yes, that was, by the way, when Reagan's election campaign was It's Morning in America, which is now recognized as one of the most successful political campaigns ever.
But by comparison with Donald Trump being shot at and hit just a month ago, the media has showed him no slack whatsoever. They never refer to that assassination attempt. He gained no moral stature by it. The vindictiveness seems to be much more virulent than it was back in the
Well, actually, they did attempt, probably to suppress is not quite the word, but they did not show that famous picture of defiance, which was a powerful image of a man bravely responding to his own near death.
Yes.
They showed it immediately afterwards, and then it disappeared until protests from people forced the television stations to show it.
One thing that came up only obliquely during our conference yesterday, but I want to explore it with you now, is, and you've mentioned it earlier, the social class from which journalists are drawn has changed radically.
Yeah.
Certainly when I started in 1972, they did ask me if I had any kind of college degree.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Now, that it didn't matter that it was out in music.
Yeah.
They were hiring me as just a regular cub reporter. But you needed a degree. But most of the men, and they were almost all men, didn't have. They were lucky to have gone through high school.
Yeah.
And as a result, you had that sort of characteristically American ferment. You had a lot of recent immigrant groups represented as journalists, the Irish kids, the Jewish kids, the Italian kids, all of whose parents or grandparents had only recently come to America.
Yeah.
And they were street kids, basically.
Yeah.
Now we see not only is there a revolving door, but they're all related to each other. They've all gone to the same Ivy League schools. They've all married each other's wives. They've all lived in each other's houses. They all vacation in the same couple of spots.
Yeah.
It's a complete social clique.
Yes, you're right. And I would say the earlier days when it was mainly a job which people without, which people with college degrees weren't interested in, was actually a very fertile and lively period of American journalism.
Yes.
Journalism was like boxing. It was a way in which poor people could get on a ladder, taking them to the
A slightly
top.
disreputable way.
Slightly disreputable. Look at the front page, the famous
Yes.
Ben Hecht play about journalism.
Yes.
I would, there's a Joe Bob Briggs. His real name is John Bloom. He's one of the great American satirists, I think, and he wrote an analysis of this point. He said the ideology of the old newsroom, with the men with green eye shades and I would say unfashionable accents. He said about those days, their ideology was they were on the side of the underdog. Now, that didn't mean to say they thought the underdog was a marvelous person. Maybe they didn't even like the underdog. They just thought that he didn't get a fair shake. And so they approached a lot of journalism with that kind of attitude. And sometimes, of course, the underdog would be a wealthy person who was being unjustly treated by a political system which is hostile to him. You get all of those kind of... In journalism, you never know who's going to turn out to be the hero and who the villain of a story until you've really looked at the story and done the spade work and the leg work. So that was a different style of journalism. Now you have the journalism of the senior common room, and it has all of the attitudes and political opinions and moral stances of the senior common room. And we call it liberalism in the past. I think that's slightly wrong, but it was a reasonably moderate left liberalism. The bias and the prejudice they were disguised somewhat, and they had rules in terms of what you could say about things which kept that bias under control. But those restraints have completely evaporated, I would say, in the last 15 years. And now what we call wokishness, wokery, it has now dominated journalism to an extraordinary extent. And it's another example of the revolving door.
Yes.
Because the closeness between government and press and media on the issue of Russiagate is one of the great scandals of American history. We don't know the full extent of it yet, but we do know that the allegations of Trump being a Russian agent, a Russian asset, working with the Russians to steal the election, in effect, those stories occupied almost the entire time of the Trump administration.
Yes.
Whether they were designed to cripple it, I don't know, but they certainly have that effect. And all of the major institutions, the New York Post, the New York Times, the Washington Post, ABC, CBS, NBC. The New York Post is the exception, of course. It was one of the small minority of outlets which were critical of this. Ditto and the Wall Street Journal to some extent. Now that is one of the... it's a massive scandal. People received Pulitzer Prizes for stories which we now know to be completely false.
Completely.
And they first of all have not lost the Pulitzers. The Pulitzers have not been withdrawn.
They won't give them back either.
No, they won't give them back. But they will not. Who has apologized for misleading the American people on a matter that that completely occupied the administration, preventing many things it might have done.
Absolutely. Well,
Yeah.
in fact, it was the subject. For one thing, it's the subject of a major piece in our book, Against the Corporate Media, by Stephen Hayward, who
Yeah.
analyzed very carefully and at some length the whole hoax. But in the Columbia Journalism Review, there was an enormous takeout
Yeah.
showing how badly the media had
Yeah.
collaborated in its own misleading of the public, and yet no heads roll.
Well, I read that piece. I read it with admiration. It's an old-fashioned, well-researched,
It was.
Carefully written, and prudent and fully accurate piece. It was a one-day wonder.
Yes, and-
They had to sort of say, somebody wrote this,
Yeah.
by the way. It's in the Columbia Journalism Review.
Somebody,
Now-
one of us wrote this. That's the thing, not just some radical
No.
right-wing nut.
But everybody else immediately consigned it to the memory hole.
Yes, gone.
And there are other cases like that. And that is a form of bias, which I think is very difficult to prove. It's really not the bias of telling lies, it's the bias of avoiding truths.
Well, suppression and omission, sins of omission are as great, if not greater, than sins of commission when it comes to journalism. But what do we do? You and I have discussed this for many years. How do we improve the journalistic situation, or is it improvable? Has it now become a terminal member of the apparatus of state? Because those journalists, and I've known many of them for all the 50 years I've been in the business, they like those perks. They like going to the vineyard in the summertime, and they like having the nice house in Capitol Hill, and they like that stuff, and they feel they've earned it, and they're not about to threaten it by some attack of morality, for goodness sake.
Well, the very best antidote is clearly free competition. And free competition here means something quite important in two ways. First of all, we have to fight any attempt to have an official definition of journalism or an official system of regulation. You know, I say at the beginning of my piece, one of the problems is that journalists have status envy. They want to be called a profession.
Yeah.
They're a trade. There's no body of knowledge. You can't be expelled from journalism.
Right. There's no examination.
No examination.
Yeah.
And once we have governments, and this happens, the European Union, I think, wants to do this, which wants an official definition and an official accreditation of journalists. I think that that's a very bad thing, because effectively some of the best journalism comes now, and has always come, some has always come, from people who aren't journalists, from experts who see something, think it was mistaken, look at it, and then write an article about it. And now, and this is my second point, the internet has produced a situation in which there are 2 or 3 million sub-editors who are liable to see something they disagree with, or see something they think is inaccurate, find a way of saying so. And that has altered several major stories.
Yes.
And it comes not from, I mean, in my view, in a free society, every citizen is a potential journalist, and some of them are the best.
Well, you would agree with Andrew Breitbart in that respect, because Andrew's vision was of citizen journalism, that he was deeply, deeply suspicious of professional journalists. And one of the areas in which he and I disagreed is I felt that you could have citizen journalism to a point, but that knowing at least the structure of journalistic reporting and the need for facts and not purely opinion, some of the basic tenets of being a professional journalist were also important. And otherwise you get led astray by rumor and gossip. And now, to your other point, Elon Musk has done something with Twitter, which is community notes, where people can say, no, that's absolutely not true.
Sure.
Here's why it's not true. And I think that's helpful. But
Well, it keeps us honest.
what's that?
It keeps us honest.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
But
Now-
what's the path forward? Is it some combination of Breitbart and accreditation? I agree with you that accreditation is I mean, they already are accredited. You know who they are because
Yeah.
you see them on CNN and
Yeah.
you see them on
Yeah.
MSNBC.
But there's no formal legal accreditation.
Right. Not yet.
No. I know lots of governments would like to bring that in, and we've seen why it's a bad idea. Now, another question, another major change is, well, something we have to prevent is using the notion of misinformation or disinformation to say that we are going to actually prevent anything you write which we differ with, we think is mistaken. For example, the Australian government at the moment is proposing such a law. Now, one of the elements of that law is going to be, one of the bill's clauses says that you cannot bring a charge of misinformation or disinformation against government departments, government officials, or government agencies. Now, we know from the COVID pandemic that much of what the government put out, in good conscience, by the way, the best information they thought they had at the time, which then came under criticism from doctors and specialists. They reached agreement with the great tech companies that they would not put this information out, this criticism of official information out, or not even criticism, this different opinion from accredited doctors and so on. They were effectively kept from writing and broadcasting their views. And secondly, sometimes they lost their jobs because they were differing with what the official argument was. That has got to, we cannot allow this new method of government control of what we read, what we see, what we think to go ahead, because effectively it will mean that the abolition of free speech, and free speech is the key to a free society. If you're not able to complain about injustice, if you're not able to notice and report inaccuracies, you're not living in a society that is genuinely free, or in the long run, genuinely efficient. Because after all, if the government and if other official bodies are allowed to suppress discussion of important questions, they will not only make mistakes, but they will make the same mistake indefinitely.
Thank you very much, John, for your addition to the book and for this conversation.
Thank you, Michael. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.